This video is brought to you by Mubi, a curated streaming service showing exceptional films from around the globe. Get a whole month free at mubi.com/broedeschanel. Also, I have a new podcast. It's called Rehash, and I'm co-hosting it with my best friend Hannah. It's all about recent social media phenomenons that get us all up in arms, only to forget about them within a week. So we rehash them, as they say. Our first season is called Public Theater, which looks at the way we as a public love to create pop culture villains. We discuss everything from the Try Guys, to Taylor Swift, to Bad Art Friend, to Diet Prada. The season is almost completely out, and you can find it wherever you get your podcasts. We also have a Patreon with bonus and weekly mini episodes if you'd like to throw us some extra support. Hope you enjoy. Like any major social phenomenon, there is no one origin of disco. Some say it began in Paris when Jane Birkin breathed Je t'aime into her mic. Some say it started with the parties at DJ David Mancuso's Loft on Lower Broadway, a private space for LGBTQ people, majority black and brown, to just let loose. But while no one can agree on where it came from, the consensus today is that when disco first started, it was by and large a countercultural space. A place of respite where marginalized people could be free from social barriers for just one night. As Nadine Hubbs so wonderfully puts it, disco served not just to provide contact, safety, and acceptance, but crucially to confirm queer persons' very existence and intact survival in a world that would make of them, if not monsters, then walking ghosts, non-entities. The long, rhythmic orchestral sounds of early disco music represented the limitlessness of this movement. They put you in a trance, where people of all walks of life could enter a state of total bliss. The goal of these DIY spaces was a nurturing one. Dance can save you, even just for one night. But like the glimmering lights of the 2001 club, disco burned hard and bright. So bright that it would soon burn out. Because, as we all know quite well, this movement died a very abrupt death. And while there have been many attempts to resurrect it over the past several decades, no one in North America has ever been able to authentically recreate the unbridled ecstasy of the original discotheque. In trend with its birth, disco has no single cause of death. Its apocalypse actually had many horsemen. There was Disco Demolition Night, which signaled for many the official death knell of the movement. The AIDS crisis is also cited as a major contributor, which ravaged the pioneering communities of disco culture and placed lethal restrictions on the freedom so pervasive in these clubs. And then there's the gentrification of the discotheque, where new regulations and coveted entrances aroused the interests of the richies and the yuppies and disenfranchised the rest. But the last horseman of the disco apocalypse was interestingly the thing that disco is now perhaps most remembered for: Saturday Night Fever. Saturday Night Fever is a low-budget 1977 dance film starring a fresh-faced John Travolta. It tells the story of Tony Manero, a 19-year-old Italian-American kid from Bay Ridge who works at a paint store by day and haunts the local discotheque by night. This little film was a cultural juggernaut when it came out. It catapulted Travolta to superstardom, cemented its soundtrack artists the Bee Gees as pillars of music history, and created such a mania around disco that the number of clubs in New York exploded exponentially. I'm sure if I held a gun to your head and asked you to recite the plot of Saturday Night Fever, chances are you wouldn't be able to do it. But you're most likely at least familiar with its basic iconography: the white polyester suit, the glimmering backdrop, John Travolta's undulating hips, the iconic opening song. To many of us today, Saturday Night Fever is disco. So how is it that a movie which became the face of this movement be responsible for its demise? Saturday Night Fever is full of contradictions. In one sense, it's a fun dance movie with great music, kinetic cinematography, and beautiful lighting. In another, it's a gritty coming-of-age film about class warfare in the ethnic enclaves of Brooklyn. It recenters the discotheque, previously dominated by racialized LGBTQ populations, around the hyper-masculine, white, straight man and his hunt for pussy. Yet the movie has also been lampooned for the ultra-feminine dancing and dress of its lead, whose sexuality has come under speculation for decades. The gritty realism of Saturday Night Fever comes from myth, yet the movie still speaks a great deal of truth. What makes Saturday Night Fever, despite its false premise, despite its mainstreaming of disco, still so resonant today? For a film that's decried for being the commercial undertaker of disco, it still feels quite raw. I think it's time we talk about it. For many of us today, disco is remembered as commercial fluff. But really, the early years of disco were anything but. People have trouble tracing disco's origins because it evolved into the American zeitgeist in a very ad hoc way. Since I'm no music expert, I spoke to Noah from the YouTube channel Polyphonic to get a better understanding of what disco sounds like and where its influences came from. He recently put out an incredible video about the history of disco himself, which you should absolutely check out. Here's Noah.
In general, what's really interesting about disco, the way it came up is kind of different than music usually comes up because it was pulling from all these different influences. In a lot of ways, I feel like it was one of the first kind of modern musical genres in that it didn't kind of come up naturally. It was curated by people who were pulling from stuff without really caring about genre. It really is kind of this melting pot because rather than musicians playing in a certain genre, it was started by DJs just picking and choosing songs that had good dance breaks.
So we can agree that it started mainly in New York, along with places like Detroit and Philadelphia, with pre-DJ figures and tastemakers like David Mancuso hosting DIY parties in their lofts and other pop-up spaces, playing and mixing records for people to dance along to for hours on end.
The big things that influence disco, the biggest one is soul music. Soul music, especially Philadelphia soul. Philadelphia soul is where the 4 to the floor beat came from. It's where a lot of the lush strings came from. So a lot of the soul music, in terms of direct musical influences, that's probably the most immediate, along with Latin American music, Latin American dance music with a lot of the kind of syncopated dance rhythms. A big part of it also comes out of the kind of ethos of disco, even if it's not quite as aesthetically similar. A lot of the ethos of disco comes out of psychedelic rock and what was happening in the 60s when you have these kind of wide open jams that let people really kind of like get into a zone on a dance floor.
Like Noah was saying, records being played were born out of other predominantly Black American musical genres, soul, funk, along with Latin and African influences in there as well. I think as a musical movement, disco is so hard to trace because it's almost like the music was secondary. As Paul Williams puts it, although the DJs competed by making new edits and remixes of their music, these weren't available for others to own, nor did they even wear the name of their creator. In other words, the party, not the record, was the product of which they were proud. And when it came to the party, disco was largely underground.
One of the big things that makes disco first start is the Stonewall riots and the emergence of the gay rights and queer rights movement. Originally, you had these dance bars where in New York, same-sex dancing was not allowed. It was banned. And then after Stonewall, those bans fell. But what happened when the bans fell was all these clubs started putting together house policies saying this couldn't happen. So what happened was all of these queer folk were like, okay, well, I can't go to these clubs to dance. I'm a queer man in the 60s. My life is hell. Homosexuality was still considered a mental illness.
So these DIY DJ-oriented spaces made it so that fringe communities who didn't feel comfortable or welcome at regular dance venues, which placed a major focus on heterosexual dance partnerships, could enjoy themselves here. BIPOC, LGBTQ people, and a lot of women would come to these spaces to let loose. In the early discotheque, the long musical tracks with lush string harmonies and repetitive percussion played by DJs were made to emphasize solo dancing.
Technically speaking, my markers for disco, a big one is a 4 to the floor beat, which means the kick drum hits on every beat. That usually anchors, and then it usually kind of builds up from there. So above the 4 to the floor beat, you have a lot of syncopation. So you have syncopated hi-hat hits, you have syncopated kind of like wah-wah chicken scratch style guitar, and you have syncopated funk bass lines. And a lot of the syncopation is where the kind of dance grooves come from. And then on top of that, you have things like strings, horns, and often I find in disco the vocals are used more for like color and timbre than they are for lyrical meaning. Donna Summer is the best at this. Like, her voice just washes over you. If you listen to something like I Feel Love, like, it's got that killer synth hook, but then like Donna Summer almost sounds like a string band rolling over you.
After Love's Theme by Barry White's Love Unlimited Orchestra made it to the top of the charts as the first official disco track, we started seeing an opening for black female artists to make their mark in the genre. Music by black disco divas like Donna Summer, whose song I Feel Love Noah had just referenced there, emphasized the full-body experience of female pleasure, an ecstasy which could be achieved through dancing alone at the club, with a bit of extra help, of course. Let's just say these clubs were not straight in more ways than one. Joshua Williams describes the groups who would attend these clubs as a counter-public. He says, "As the public sphere serves to appeal to dominant culture and the discourse surrounding it, the counter-public disturbs its larger counterpart through addressing its indefinite strangers, recognizing its estrangement, and establishing their subjectivity as the focus of their own discursive space in respect to the wider public." So this really was a subversive time, far from commercial fluff. Actually, disco made its mark by establishing itself as everything that the mainstream culture was not. But of course, as the American cultural climate began to shift in the 1970s, this would and could not last forever. It seems that over the course of the decade, people were allured by the new forms of self-expression the disco had to offer, and industry titans couldn't help but capitalize on this moment. So, okay, like I said earlier, a few things were happening here all at once. In terms of the party, the sheer volume of nightclubs that exploded in major cities sparked a wave of government regulations. Now, club owners had to deal with a host of new worries: fire codes, sprinkler requirements, noise restrictions, community planning boards, which skyrocketed the cost of running a club. For example, Steve Rebell and Ian Schrager, who had opened their first nightclub in Queens for $27,000, were now, in 1977, opening their next one for $400,000. This new one was called Studio 54, which is known today as one of the most elite clubs in history.
I think in the early days, it was grittier, it was kind of darker, it was a little more hamstrung together, and then Studio 54 is kind of pure glitz and glamour. It's celebrity, it's a naked man in glitter riding a horse into the studio, it's moving theater sets. It is kind of the Hollywoodization of disco.
Everyone who was anyone went to Studio 54, which meant that the new celebrification of disco would of course arouse the interest of yuppie copycats. The clubs which could afford to stay open had to adjust to rising costs by raising the cost of entrance. They also made it so that people getting into the club could experience their own celeb treatment. Lineups, guest lists, and entrance fees made disco anything but DIY, safe, and easygoing. Even Schrager had recounted that what this did was disenfranchise young people, but more specifically, it disenfranchised poor, marginalized people who were once the bread and butter of this movement. In terms of the music, labels like Motown and Philadelphia International Records, as well as radio stations which primarily cater to black audiences, began to encourage disco's extreme inclusivity by taking a more colorblind approach to the genre. A more distinctly disco sound was emerging, and it was coming full circle. Big artists like Diana Ross and Marvin Gaye started making club hits, which made it more comfortable for white artists like David Bowie and Rod Stewart to cross over. As this happened and the interests of white straight audiences were being piqued, the black musical inspirations of funk and soul started giving way to a much more sanitized, white sound that would eventually evolve into that Giorgio Moroder-inspired Euro disco sound we're so familiar with today. This turned a lot of black audiences who viewed this as having undermined black artists' move towards musical self-determination off of what disco was now known to be. And now, a musical style and culture which had previously been ignored by radio, which freed it of all corporate restrictions, was now being crafted for the masses. As Tavia Nyong'o so aptly identifies, the fear and loathing of disco seemed to result from the music industry's determination to force an unwilling contact between the underground and the mainstream in the name of a crossover that, it turned out, only succeeded in crossing out the flavors most valued by those in the know, while failing to rid itself entirely of that odor most noxious to outsiders, the pungency of gender, racial, and sexual difference. So, it was around this transitional time that Saturday Night Fever came out. The film, which came out in 1977, is based off an article for New York Mag called Tribal Rites of the New Saturday Night. Written by British journalist Nick Cohn, the article alleges to take on this sort of ethnographic look at Brooklyn's Bay Ridge disco scene. This is how Cohn, in his Discovery Channel type prose, describes his wily subject, who he calls a face of the club. To qualify as an Odyssey face, an aspirant need only be Italian, between the ages of 18 and 21, with a minimum stock of 6 floral shirts, 4 pairs of tight trousers, 2 pairs of Gucci-style loafers, 2 pairs of platforms, either a pendant or a ring, and 1 item in gold. In addition, he must know how to dance, how to drive, how to handle himself in a fight. He must have respect, even reverence for facehood, and contempt for everything else. He must also be fluent in obscenity. Most important of all, he must play tough. The scene Cohn builds for us of the mid-70s discotheque is one where straight Italian men dominate the dance floor, where ethnic groups are constantly warring, where women are treated as disposable and secondary, and where black people are barely even granted entrance. If you're wondering why this scene sounds completely different from the one I painted for you earlier, it's because it's totally fake. Cohn would later reveal in 1996 that his article was completely fabricated. The quote, face he was describing wasn't Italian, but rather a combination of influences from hardened young men he had known in the UK. Actually, it sounds like Cohn hadn't even made it into the 2001 Odyssey because a drunk guy threw up on his leg at the door. But since this wasn't known back in 1976, director John Badham was able to pick it up and create from it a film very much founded upon the supposed gritty realism of this disco scene in Bay Ridge. In Saturday Night Fever, Tony Manero and his gang of Italian-American hooligans are the stars of the discotheque. Girls stumble over themselves just to dance next to them, they have an in with the DJs and the doormen, and win every dance competition. The movie also goes to great lengths to display the group's overt violent racism and homophobia. So by nature of its focus, the film brought a relatively dishonest image of disco to the general public. And to add fuel to fire, Saturday Night Fever was a massive hit. While Travolta had actually been dancing to popular disco hits of the time during filming, Badham brought in British group The Bee Gees, who had recently put out a couple disco hits of their own, to write a cohesive soundtrack for the film. The group wrote it in a single weekend, the film was dubbed over, and the soundtrack went on to be one of the best-selling albums of all time. Of course, its poppy sounds were more adjacent to the sanitized hits of later disco than to the movement's earlier records, yet it's still been credited both with popularizing and even originating the genre. So ultimately, the film took the long rhythmic songs of the club, most often sung by black divas, and turned them into digestible pop hits by, well, these guys. They are so precious, though. All in all, Saturday Night Fever was not accurate to what disco was really all about, and by centering its hero onto a white straight guy, it erased all signs that a counterpublic for this movement ever existed. As Nyong'o says, Saturday Night Fever encapsulated for many the drawbacks of crossover, granting as it did center stage to a racist, misogynist, and homophobic anti-hero, and passing the musical torch to the Bee Gees, admittedly great songwriters, who nonetheless accented over faithfulness to the underground sound. And in bringing disco to an infinitely larger international audience, it solidified the movement as a major cultural force. And boy, did this make people mad. White rock fans who fancied themselves industry outsiders viewed disco as a commercial threat to the art of music. This is a bit ironic given that it was rock music which dominated the charts during the 2 decades leading up to disco's emergence, and that both genres had their roots in black music, which casts some doubt on what these guys were really angry about. Disco had platformed black women, who had very much been frozen out by the rock establishment, and openly gay black artists like Sylvester, whose overt sexuality would obviously cast a threat to the very straight, very male focus of rock. As John Rockwell articulates in a 1990 retrospective for the New York Times about the war on disco, the late 1970s marked the apex of gay culture, bursting with an exhilarating, even arrogant confidence in its own strength and future. Disco music, along with an anti-rock cabaret style, was a gay sonic emblem. The fear was real. Major voices in rock, like shock jock Steve Dahl, were vocal opponents of the movement.
Through the 60s and early 70s, radio DJs became kind of minor celebrities in their own right. They were personalities, entertainers, tastemakers. You have kind of the car culture of the 60s and 70s. Cars were super cheap, where you have a lot of people driving around in their cars, a lot of these kids driving around listening to the radio. You kind of had a new style of album-oriented radio. Rather than just playing kind of the pop hits, people would, throw on a whole side of a Pink Floyd record. That sort of mentality creates these radio DJ personalities, like Steve Dahl. So he kind of comes out of this.
Dahl, who had been let go from his previous radio station because it had turned disco, positioned himself as the anti-establishment everyman. After years of antagonizing the art form, Dahl used the propagandistic language of war and galvanized his young, straight, white male fans to bring all the disco records they could find, storm a White Sox game in Comiskey Stadium, and commence a mass burning and bombing of these albums. This was the moment that signified for many the spiritual death of disco.
It's a very early example of the kind of culture war that we just deal with all of the time now. On the surface level, all of this stuff is just against the oversaturation of disco, but there's this undercurrent, right, where disco is queer music and black music. There's these kind of signifiers. Steve Dahl's fans, he calls them the insane coho lips. They're named after the coho salmon, which is a fish that was introduced into Lake Michigan to eradicate parasites. One of the telling things about this Disco Demolition Night is a lot of people brought disco records, but there was also, like, Stevie Wonder records, and Stevie Wonder's not disco, but he is a black artist who was dominating the charts and the awards in the late 70s.
When Fran Lebowitz looks back on Disco Demolition Night, she observes, "There's music I don't like, but I don't make a career out of not liking it. I just don't listen to it. Disco sucks was a kind of panic on the part of straight white guys. Disco was basically black music. Rock and roll was basically white. Those guys felt displaced." But on top of the feelings of displacement and the racist and homophobic sentiments, I think there was also something else going on here. I actually think that in becoming so popular and centering the straight white dude as the face of the movement, Saturday Night Fever reflected back onto straight rock fans a fantasy image of who they could be if they let disco continue to grow. It took a subculture associated with the fringe and the other and made it safe. See, straight guys can enjoy disco too. And maybe that was the most terrifying thing of all. I said this before, but while a lot of people remember the general iconography of Saturday Night Fever, most of us can't actually recite the plot to save our lives. Turns out our collective memory of it aligns very little with the material of the film itself. And because of this, history has erased the rich interplay of ideas and questions that the movie presents us with. So, what happens? The film starts with Tony going to work at the paint store, checking out some ladies along the way, and then running home to get ready for his night out. He and his friends head to the club, where they're treated like scrappy royalty. Tony is the most sought-after man at the function. All the girlies are clamoring to dance with him, namely a girl named Annette, who Tony believes is too desperate and prudish. However, all the potential women he could leave with fall to the wayside when he locks eyes on Stephanie, a slightly older woman who's dancing with her partner to a Latin song that none of the other Italians will dance to. The two exchange a faraway giggle, but nothing comes of it. Tony agrees to partner with Annette for the upcoming dance competition, but is elated when he finds Stephanie practicing at their dance studio. Tony ditches Annette for Stephanie, and the two have coffee together, where she brags about her new chic life at a Manhattan agency and chastises Tony for being a typical Bay Ridge deadbeat with no real aspirations. This hits a nerve for Tony, whose family already treat him like he's a good-for-nothing, especially next to his priest brother. But things start looking up when it's revealed that his brother left the priesthood and admits he was only doing it to please their parents. Both Stephanie and his brother think that Tony should pursue his passion for dancing in a real way, but he's very much still wrapped up in the narrow thinking of Bay Ridge life, especially when his friend Gus is attacked by who he alleges was a Puerto Rican gang. The group seek revenge on the gang and attack them at their local hangout. They all get badly hurt in the process, except for this little guy Bobby, who drives away out of fear, only to discover that Gus had been wrong and it actually wasn't the gang who attacked him. The boys turn on him and Bobby, sending Bobby, who has already been going through it due to the fact that his girlfriend is pregnant and likely can't get an abortion, into further despair. After this ordeal, the boys roll up to 2001, donning fresh bruises, and Tony and Stephanie perform their number. They win the competition, but Tony is incensed because he believes that the Puerto Rican dancers deserved it more. He angrily hands the couple his trophy and then proceeds to try and assault Stephanie in her car. She gets away, but Tony is still enraged. He gets into the car with his friends and Annette, who has been getting steadily more intoxicated as the night goes on, and they all drive to the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, a place they like to goof around at after a night out. During the drive, two of Tony's friends take turns assaulting Annette. Tony coldly shames her for the assault, and she runs out of the car in anguish. He follows her, which is when Bobby, also wasted, takes the opportunity to jump on the railing of the bridge and dance around. He laments that Tony had not been there for him, and then falls off the edge to his death. When asked later by police if Bobby had done it on purpose, Tony says,
"Ways of killing yourself without killing yourself."
Yeah. Okay, you can go now.
Tony, shaken by his friend's death, takes the train overnight all the way to Manhattan and shows up at Stephanie's house to apologize. At first, she rejects his apology, but then the two reconcile and agree to be friends. Finito. Okay, so I'm sure you'll notice that the film has some pretty dark themes. Yeah. When I say Saturday Night Fever is gritty, I mean that when I rewatched it for this video, I was clutching my face, mouth open, for the entire final 20 minutes. It really rattled me, and I had already seen it before. I really think it's a shame that Saturday Night Fever is only remembered for being disco fluff, when really it's a very thoughtful contribution to the Hollywood New Wave. New Hollywood, which I've talked about before on this channel, was an era of mid-century filmmaking where movies were starting to become more director-driven, artful, and reflective of a rapidly changing zeitgeist. We were seeing more character studies, moral ambiguity, less censorship because the Hays Code had ended, and so on. Stuff like Taxi Driver, Easy Rider, The Godfather, Paper Moon, The Long Goodbye, etc. Writers like Paul Schrader were focusing on a new kind of subject, who he called God's Lonely Man, cold, alienated avatars of an evolving masculinity. Just take Schrader's own film American Gigolo from 1980, composed by none other than Giorgio Moroder, and which Travolta himself was supposed to star in. Instead, Richard Gere stars as Julian Kay, a high-end escort who becomes a prime suspect for the murder of one of his clients. Julian is acutely aware of his sensuality, and uses it to his advantage. Obsessed with an appearance perfectly crafted for female attention, he's also desperate for class mobility. These are all traits reflected in Tony, only 3 years earlier. Although Saturday Night Fever had displaced the identity of the disco-goer onto the straight dude, in doing so, it offered up a very new kind of masculinity. At first glance, the film displays a very harrowing portrait of masculine behavior. But if you look a bit closer, none of Tony's racism, misogyny, or homophobia goes unnoticed. The film is very careful to show us how well the black couple performs at the competition, especially when compared to Tony and Stephanie's much more elementary routine. Yet the couple doesn't even place. Same goes for how clearly Tony is upset about winning over the much obviously better Puerto Rican couple. When the group harasses a gay couple walking through the underpass, the camera focuses on the couple rather than Tony and his friends, and their clear terror at what could happen to them if they engage. We only see Annette's face during and after she's assaulted, the pure devastation of her expression. It's incredibly painful to see, and this doesn't feel like an accident. Annette especially is a very sympathetic character. Tony is so clearly in the wrong in all his interactions with her. The film allows viewers to see these horrible sides of him, but he is, at the young age of 19, very much a product of his toxic environment. His father is domineering towards their family, especially the women. His friends behave abominably everywhere they go. All of this results in a film that really feels more like an early indictment of toxic masculinity rather than a celebration of it. The New York bridges in Saturday Night Fever are a metaphor for social stratification. Tony even says this outright in his diatribe here.
I come down here a lot, you know, I get ideas.
Oh yeah, what kind of ideas you get?
I don't know, daydreams, you know, I daydream a lot.
The bridge is a literal path for upward mobility in the case of Stephanie, who rides it with Tony to move to her new apartment in the city, and it's an instrument of stagnation for his friends, where they gallivant and then go home. Even eternal stagnation in the case of Bobby, or the story Tony tells of a man who was accidentally entombed in it forever when the bridge was built. When Tony rides the train over the bridge at the end of the film, away from his regressive friends and family, he climbs out of his backwards environment and becomes a new kind of man. And while Tony often represents the worst aspects of masculinity, he's also very unafraid, or maybe unaware, of looking feminine. Tony wears tight pants, he's obsessed with his perfectly coiffed hair, he swivels his hips, he struts, and he wears heels. His favorite activity is ballroom dancing. As Nyong'o observes, the unhappy hybridity of disco is still evinced in the uneasy status of its foremost cultural avatars, the Bee Gees and John Travolta playing Tony Manero, white men occupying vocal registers and striking choreographic poses that usurp the disco diva and the gay man, while at the same time infringing upon, even denaturing, the very white masculinity that such a colonizing movie is supposed to secure. By blending the hardened working-class sensibilities of men from the UK with the accoutrements of New York clubgoers, Nick Cohn and John Badham inadvertently created a fantasy picture of a male subject who was emerging in cinema at this time. The perfect blend of the masculine and feminine. This was in many ways very subversive for the time. So while we can certainly criticize Saturday Night Fever for presenting a warped picture of what disco actually looked like, it also espoused many important truths about where the culture wanted to go before it was suppressed again. And suppressed it was. Following the unnecessary violence of Disco Demolition Night, regular villain of this channel Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1981, bringing with him a whole new vision of what America should look like. One where, much like the 1950s, men were patriarchs and breadwinners, women were doting and passive, and gay people simply didn't exist. This unfortunately emerged in tandem with the AIDS epidemic, where cases of the virus started popping up predominantly in the queer communities of major cities like New York and San Francisco that same year. As America under Reagan reverted back to its regular conservatism, these communities were dying out en masse with no word of concern from authorial bodies. Of course, this devastated the disco scene. It was no longer safe to go dancing and freely pursue intimacy, and frankly, people were too terrified to be carefree. By the time disco demolition, Reagan, and the AIDS crisis happened, disco was more or less considered a bougie, elitist, commercial phenomenon. But of course, that's not what it was at its core. Joshua Williams points out that as the 70s came to an end, disco represented both a disengagement from the acceptable morals championed by the new right's white conservative traditionalists and the general public's need for class equality, an issue that disco formally aimed to address at its beginnings. And isn't this something that Saturday Night Fever also kind of addresses?
The big thing that happened in the mid-70s is that the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries started an oil embargo, which caused the 70s recession. And so what happened from the 70s recession is now you suddenly have this generation of kids who are kind of like a little too young to be part of the hippie movement, but were influenced by the kind of free love hippies. You have kind of the death of the hippie dream. The economy is collapsing. They don't really feel like they've got a future. You've got these, unemployed teens or people in their young 20s with nothing to do.
Much of new Hollywood filmmaking is concerned with frustrations that came out of the economic downturn in the 70s. Saturday Night Fever is no different. The film kicked off an entire genre of dance films over the next few decades, all of which have echoed to varying degrees of success its general themes. Mainly that key intersection between poverty and masculinity, which is so interesting given that dancing has long been considered a pretty effeminate art form. Tony's life is, for the most part, listless and stagnant, which has instilled a brimming sense of violence and rage within him. But when he gets on that dance floor each Saturday, his purpose is reinvigorated. Dance is something primal within all of us, something we can all share regardless of where we come from. So for many, it's the great equalizer. This is why dance films really are such a great tool for class commentary. While Brooklyn is mostly associated today with millennial hipsters, only 2 decades ago it was something completely different. Bay Ridge in the film, which is by no means the most impoverished or even racialized neighborhood of Brooklyn, is a space of eternal struggle and hardship, where the ethnic subgroups of New York are ghettoized and left to war amongst themselves. But at the center of it is the 2001 Odyssey, a glimmering, intoxicating no man's land where people can put their rage to rest and just let go. And isn't this the original ethos of disco? Saturday Night Fever was created out of a lie, but like I said, it also speaks a great deal of truth. And this is a confusing thing to reconcile. I think the truth ultimately lies in the dance. When interviewed about the early days of disco, composer and producer Nile Rodgers, co-founder of Chic, one of the most successful disco groups, recalled, "As founding members of this fledgling counterculture lifestyle, we held our meetings and demonstrations on the dance floor. They were more expressive, political, and communal than the hippies before them because they bonded through their bodies, through dance. They were propelled by a new kind of funky groove music. Dance had become primal and ubiquitous, a powerful communication tool every bit as motivational as an Angela Davis speech or treasured as that $18 3-day Woodstock Festival ticket. All revolutionary movements are fueled by a desire for change to an unsustainable status quo. Dance was the language of the disco revolution. And I think this is what's contributed to Saturday Night Fever's enduring quality. There are many outdated aspects of it that make me cringe 45 years on, but the film still feels so raw, so real. It may be predicated on a dead movement, but realistically, disco never really died. Sure, the Horsemen all contributed to destroying disco's mainstream viability. Major disco groups like the Bee Gees and Chic abruptly fell from their positions on the charts. Artists like Michael Jackson, whose success as an individual artist can largely be attributed to the disco movement, pivoted towards other sounds. Disco as we knew it almost disappeared from the public eye. But there was also something beautiful that came out of this.
That kind of just forced disco to go back underground, and that's where disco was born anyways. So a lot of really cool stuff happened from the underground. House music in the 80s spun out of disco, and, out of disco and house broadly, EDM as a genre, as we understand it, completely birthed out of disco. Hip-hop The way that hip-hop started, it was birthed out of kind of turntablism that came from disco. Like in the early disco days, there were DJs who would have multi-turntable switchers where they would find a dance loop on a record, and because this dance loop was only, 16 bars or whatever, they would have 2 copies of the record, and they would play 16 bars and then swap the fader to the other one and play those 16 bars. And from that, kind of what happens is you start to have these people looping these drum breaks. The DJs would do kind of shout stuff and do little rhymes and stuff over top. And that's a lot of the foundation for hip hop and rap music. It's hard to listen to a trap song and be like, oh yeah, disco is the origins of this, but it 100% is. And even like things like sampling and stuff like that, and the crate digging culture. So all of that comes out of disco. One of the big kind of hit makers of top 40 pop through the 90s is Max Martin, and through the 2000s. Max Martin, produces Britney Spears, produces Katy Perry, like huge hit maker. He's from Sweden and born out of the Eurodisco that ABBA brought there.
And there's a pretty clear through line between the cultures of these once underground genres that came out of disco. As Rockwell puts it, from all-purpose dance music, disco in everything but the name, to rap and hip-hop and house, the persistence of a driving rhythmic music, the body liberated against a grid of pulsing metric regularity, lived on. Saturday Night Fever, just like the heart and soul of disco, lives on because, like Rockwell said back in 1990, people just want to dance. Saturday Night Fever is many things, but at its heart, it's a dance film. Slowly inching out of the pandemic, I've seen a resurgence of hugely popular dance events popping up in my city. It's shown me that people want to be together, to move together, and foster a sense of community. It's shown me that this is a timeless desire. And watching Saturday Night Fever 45 years on, this is the truth I see in it. Dancing was, for marginalized communities, for Tony, an escape from reality. And it's that, the dance film, and its distorted utopia, that made this video come to be. What a fascinating piece of history. As disco diva Gloria Gaynor said, disco music is alive and well and living in the hearts of music lovers around the world. It simply changed its name to protect the innocent. Dance music. There's no better music for a party. It helps you get rid of the stresses of the day.
Disco, in my mind, it's the most important musical movement since rock, maybe since jazz. If you turn on top 40 radio, chances are almost every single song in the top 40 owes something to disco.
So did Saturday Night Fever kill disco? It's hard to say. The movie definitely contributed to ousting marginalized groups from the conversation, but it also simultaneously celebrated disco's liberatory powers, and did it so successfully that it helped to trigger an entire moral panic. If disco got Tony, it'll come for you too. When Richard Dyer wrote his defense of disco for a journal called The Gay Left back in 1979, he made a really beautiful point. Disco can't change the world or make the revolution. No art can do that, and it's pointless to expect it to. But partly by opening up experience, partly by changing definitions, art and disco can be used. To which one might risk adding the refrain, if it feels good, use it. Saturday Night Fever used it, and this had its consequences. But at the end of the day, it's an artifact of a distant, unattainable past. It may not have been revolutionary, but it did embody all the contradictions of disco. High culture and low culture, feminine and masculine, commercial and subversive, inclusive and exclusive, and for that, it's worth talking about. I want to give a shout out to Mubi for sponsoring this video. Mubi is a curated streaming service dedicated to elevating great cinema from all around the globe. It's for lovers of great cinema and those who don't know they love great cinema yet. Because the beauty of Mubi is that it exposes you to artful, thought-provoking, and innovative films you would never think to watch. I've been meaning to check out the work of Pedro Almodovar for forever, and I recently found this short film by him on Mubi called The Human Voice, starring Tilda Swinton. It's Almodovar's first English-language film about a woman waiting to meet her old lover, as she walks through a deconstructed, almost Brechtian bedroom set. The Human Voice follows themes of yearning, obsession, and power. Comprising almost entirely of a monologue delivered to AirPods, it's the perfect spotlight for Swinton's talents. If you're looking for something offbeat, rich, and evocative, you can find it right here. From iconic directors to emerging auteurs, discover the best of cinema at your fingertips, streaming anytime, anywhere. You can try Mubi free for 30 days at mubi.com/broedeschanel. That's mubi.com/broedeschanel for a whole month of great cinema for free. Special thank you to Louis Osta, Syed Hassan, Mel Pertwee, Morgan, Cooper Stimson, Nina E., Nadia C., Nick, Jenny Eller, J. Frost McFinnigan, Gabriel M., The Wiz Daniel, D.H. Klein, Pete Holland, Carrie Gavin, and Kelly Wolf for supporting this channel.